I simulated Trump's policies in Democracy 4, a government simulation game, and this is what happened. Over the last weeks, I have read hundreds of articles about Trump's promises in the campaign and his policies during his 4 years in government. I took notes and I matched his positions with policies available in Democracy 4. Trump supports record funding for the police. I go to the simulation and massively increase funding for the police. Trump wants to reduce the corporate tax. I reduce the corporate tax. Trump likes nuclear energy. I allow widespread expansion of nuclear energy. Overall, I mapped 100 policies that Trump supports in 7 different areas and I fitted it into the simulation. So are you ready? Let's see what happened. So let's talk about the economy and let's talk about the GDP, because this is really something that I did not expect. For context, the simulation started around here when we started introducing policies, and I really did not expect this. So GDP at the beginning went down, and then it remained persistently low during the whole simulation. I really did not expect this because in line with Trump's promises, I basically cancelled all kinds of pollution controls. If you're interested, there's a very complete, very interesting article on the New York Times about how Trump reduced or cancelled different regulations of the Obama era in everything that has to do with emission controls and emissions regulations and standards. Also in line with what Trump promises in his famous drill baby drill, I offered high oil drilling subsidies to increase the supply of oil, which is supposed to reduce oil prices and improve the GDP, improve the growth of the country. So I offered very high oil drilling subsidies, and still, while it's supposed to improve the situation, it didn't really have a high impact. GDP remained very, very low. I also did other things like increasing quantitative easing. This is basically a form of unconventional monetary policy where the central bank effectively prints extra money and uses it to purchase bonds and stocks. Since the situation was so bad, I eventually offered stimulus checks, which in the simulation are called helicopter money. This is basically money that you give directly to the people to allow them to consume, reduce poverty and stimulate the economy. So this was supposed to have a big impact. I increased it quite a lot, and still GDP remained extremely low. I took other measures to stimulate the economy in line with what Trump has promised or in line with what Trump has done in the past. So for instance, I offered rural development subsidies, something that Trump seems in favor of. He has spoken about it several times. Even though, to be fair, during his presidency, he actually decreased the funding for rural areas in some cases, but that's for another day. And in general, beyond reducing pollution controls or reducing car emission standards and things like this, I also reduced or eliminated all kinds of regulations because Trump has talked about this a lot. He has talked about deregulating the economy, that is reducing regulations, and he has talked about eliminating the administrative state. So basically, the state having an important role in terms of regulating the economy. So in practice, this means different things. I reduced other regulations such as consumer rights. I reduced competition law to make it very pro-companies. I decreased labor rights pretty much to the minimum. I reduced work safety laws. I canceled all kinds of limits to automated trading. All these are things that Trump did during his presidency, so we can expect him to do something similar again during the second term. For instance, during his presidency, he massively reduced work safety regulations, he reduced the number of workplace inspections, and he trimmed the regulatory powers of several federal agencies. So again, he's spoken a lot about this, about reducing regulation to making companies' lives better, which is supposed to stimulate the economy and make GDP go up. But this didn't quite happen in the simulation. So what happened? Why did GDP remain so low during the whole simulation? I think there are 2 main reasons for this. The first one was kind of bad luck, because during his presidency, according to the simulation, there was quite a huge global recession, which of course also has an impact on America's economy and the GDP. So that was kind of bad luck. By the end, the global economy was doing better, but still that didn't allow the United States economy, the GDP, to go up. Then there were other important reasons why the GDP didn't go up. First of all, Trump's policies eventually created a huge debt crisis. We will talk about taxes later, but basically, I fit it into the game his promises. I reduced the corporate tax, I slightly reduced the income tax because he has offered to exempt tips and social security benefits from taxes. And at the same time, in line with his promises again, I kept very high military spending. I didn't make any cuts into healthcare or social security as he has promised. I massively increased the funding for the police, money to buy military equipment for the police, and there were also other additional costs related to oil subsidies, rural development, agriculture subsidies, or biofuel subsidies. All things that he has promised to do, but all that has led to a massive deficit, which in turn has led to a debt crisis. A debt crisis, of course, creates huge problems for the economy. It reduces business confidence and it creates high interest rates. There's an element of truth in this simulation. I mean, debt in the US has increased exponentially both during Republican and Democratic administrations, and the Trump presidency was not an exception. So here we can see how the red line, which is the expenditure of the United States, went up by a lot. It almost doubled with all the different subsidies and policies that Trump did. And the income, that is this green line here, it slightly reduced, which basically means that if you have more expenditure and less income, the deficit is way bigger and the debt will grow and grow. Here we can see the blue line, the debt of the United States, how it just continued to go up exponentially, and this made the interest rates to go up, the pink line. So I don't really think there will be a debt crisis under Donald Trump's presidency. I think this simulation, what it shows is that his promises are a bit unrealistic because he has promised to reduce taxes, but at the same time increase the funding for the police, the military, and different things, while at the same time keeping the same level of spending on healthcare, education, and social security. So that doesn't seem realistic. I mean, you need to match the income with the expenditure. If you do that, if you reduce taxes by a lot and at the same time you increase the expenditure, you create a huge deficit that eventually creates problems in terms of business confidence, high interest rates for your debt, and eventually creates a debt crisis. And if you have a debt crisis, the GDP will plummet. So there were several other reasons why GDP remained so low. One of them is the skills shortage. I will speak about education later, but this basically means that there are not enough qualified workers for the level of technology of the economy. So that was a huge problem. It also didn't allow the GDP to go up. Another reasons were a very high oil price. Here we can see how the price of oil remained extremely high, even though we tried to promote the oil supply through oil drilling subsidies, but that didn't help that much. And that's mostly due to the high demand for oil and also the very weak strength of the dollar, which basically means that it's much more expensive to buy oil. And then there were other reasons, such as the high level of crime or also the low level of business confidence, which in turn is also related to the debt crisis and other issues like extreme violence and crime. Beyond GDP, I also introduced other promises made by Trump. One of them is the introduction of high import tariffs. So this is basically taxes that you have to pay when you export goods to the United States. So he has promised a minimum of 10% tariffs, and for Chinese goods specifically 60%. And so I introduced very high tariffs, as you can see. This does have a high impact in terms of reducing unemployment, but of course it has a very bad impact when it comes to international trade for obvious reasons and foreign relations. So of course other countries don't really like it when you make them pay extra money to export their goods to other countries, but patriots really like it. So these tariffs help the unemployment to go down because it basically means that it's more expensive to buy goods produced in other countries, so that will promote the production of goods, the industry in the country, in the United States. So that's why unemployment went down. And here we can see how at the very beginning of the simulation, unemployment went up, basically because of the bad economic situation and the very low GDP. But then, mostly because of the high tariffs, it started to go down, but then it stayed quite stable, which is interesting because it shows that in the end, the main reasons for unemployment are GDP and also the level of industrial automation. So different policies such as state schools, rural development grants, agriculture subsidies, tariffs, military spending, etc. do help to reduce unemployment, but in the end, you need the economy to be doing good, and you also have to deal with the issue of industrial automation. Let's now have a look at the taxes. So first of all, in line with Trump's promises, I reduced the corporation tax. This is a direct tax on the profits of business. So in real life right now, the tax is at 21%, and Trump has promised to reduce it to 20%, but to 15% for businesses that produce goods in the United States. Now, there's not such option of having two different corporate taxes in this simulation. So what I did is to set it at 18% because I think that's a reasonable average. And then what I did is to reduce the income tax because this is something that Trump has promised to. He has promised to exempt tips and social security benefits from these taxes. Again, there's not such detailed option in the simulation. So what I did was to reduce slightly the income tax. So here we can see how this actually had a big impact in terms of the income of the state. It went down by a lot, and this is due to the combination of decreasing the tax but also the bad economic situation. If there's a recession, that means that less people are paying taxes and you receive less income, and if on top of that you reduce the tax, then that means that you start to run out of money basically because the income is plummeting. So beyond that, in line with what Trump has done during his presidency and what in general Republicans really liked, I introduced a very high merit tax allowance. This is basically a tax break for married couples, given as an encouragement for people to marry and also to stick together. So basically it means that you have discounts in the taxes that you have to pay if you pay as a married couple. So what this does is to create incentives to be married and remain married. That's why religious people, conservative people, and parents really like it because it basically supports the nuclear family and it decreases the amount of single parents and single people overall, and also gender tension. The problem, of course, is that it costs money because you are getting less taxes. You are reducing the income of the state. Then I left other taxes without touching. I didn't change the sales tax. I didn't change the inheritance tax because Trump has not spoken about it, neither in terms of increasing it or decreasing it. So all that stayed the same. What I did do is I changed the earned income tax credit. This is a federal tax credit, so a discount in the taxes that you have to pay for working people. This is actually a policy that both Democrats and Republicans have supported a lot over the last couple of decades because it's a tax discount that you get if you work, but you still have a low income. So what it does is that it creates incentives for people to work because if you're unemployed, you don't get it. And also it reduces poverty because it basically means that people who have a low income, they have to pay less taxes. And therefore, it reduces unemployment, it reduces poverty, and it improves equality by a bit. Of course, the problem is that this is very expensive because, again, you're reducing the amount of income that the state gets. So those were the only changes that I did in terms of taxes. And again, as you can see here, the green line, that meant that the income went down by a bit, which paired with the increasing amount of expenditures meant that there was a growing deficit and that eventually created a debt crisis.